Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you again for this time that we have. We ask now that you'd be with us, that you would guide us, protect us. I pray that you would guide our hearts, Lord, and our minds as through these presentations, Lord, that you would help us to see what's true, and you would help us to see these lines, Lord, that they would change us on an individual level, Lord. I pray that you would be with us now, Lord, and you would change our hearts and our minds. We thank you and we love you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So, we left off and we were talking about, we were doing a review. We're trying to quickly get through this review to get everyone up to the same page so that we can continue, and we're almost done with it. And like I said, we're making big hurdles over some of these things, and forgive me if things aren't making full sense. And if they're not, like I said before, just put them in the questions. What I put them in the comments or the chat. Sorry. What I realized is I have to leave in between the meeting. I left in the last one to do something with the video. So if you mentioned a question since our last presentation, just 15 minutes or so ago, put it back into the chat because I don't see it anymore. If you didn't, obviously that's fine, but just to remind everyone, if you're waiting for a response and I just can't see it at this moment, so just repost them if you have. Okay, that's good. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll continue, and we're going to look at the body of the Declaration of Independence. So let's open our Declaration of Independences again. So we read the first paragraph, our first sentence. It's a sentence, and we saw that it was saying basically that here's where we are. We're down here. We are connected to Great Britain, and we are unequal to the other nations of the world. And what we want to be is disconnected from Great Britain, and we want to be equal to the nations of the world. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you this letter, this declaration of our independence, because we think you deserve you deserve an answer. So now we want to get into the meat of this document. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the portion we're going to be breaking down, and then we'll go back through and we'll break it down, little by little, but we'll just read the whole thing first. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay, and we'll stop there for now. Okay, so we're going to read that section again, and we'll just do it slowly, and we'll break down the points of it, the significant points. So before we do that, I just want to make some space on our board. Okay. So, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What truths are they saying are self-evident? It's the truths that they're about to say. And that may seem obvious, but maybe to some people I've heard there be a question there. So they're saying what we're about to say next is what we think is self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the first thing we see right off the bat there is that all men are created equal. And I want us to note how important this idea is. The idea of equality, we know, is a prophetic subject that we're dealing with now presently. But if we can see the significance of this document, we can see that we're in the year, if you can mentally put yourself in the year 1776, you're about to break, it's the 4th of July, let's say it's the day before, the 3rd of July, you're about to break from Great Britain and send this document to them. You're about to embark on this journey of starting a new nation, which not many people get to do. And the first thing that you want to emphasize when you write this document is that all men are created equal. To me, that is a infinitely significant point for this document. And if you think about the context of the document, what's going on here? Because, again, not only do they have to change, and I erased it, but the political institutions, but they have to change the mindsets as well, the mindset of the Dark Ages. So they're coming to this, and they're saying there's this self-evident truth that all men are created equal. And I would argue that that is not self-evident, because it wasn't during the 1260, because the self-evident truth actually during the 1260 was that people were not equal, that there were categories of people, that there were classes of people, and not all people were the same, and there's lots of things we could say about that, but, about how they thought that. But the general idea is that they thought that all people weren't equal. And so the first thing that they're going to say in this document is actually, we espouse the idea, the truth, that all men are created equal. And the reason they're equal is because they're created by God. And God had equality in mind when he did it. He made everyone equally. We're all the human race. And because of that equality, and let me just read it again, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And we'll talk about those rights in a second, but let me just mention this again. So we mentioned before that the way the United States is going to end is going to be how it began. So the issue, the problem that we're going to see, and let me do this slightly different. Let me say it from a different way. So, and let me use the kingdoms of Bible prophecy. And I'm going to do this very simplistically, and hopefully that's okay for everyone. So you have the 5th kingdom of Bible prophecy right here. The 5th kingdom is the kingdom that we're talking about here. It's the 1260 kingdom. It's the kingdom of oppression, the kingdom of inequality, the kingdom of all those bad things. And so we'll just say oppression. Write that bigger. We'll say oppression and inequality. Probably sums up what is going on during that history. So again, that's the 1260. And so now we're in the year 1798. And what happens here is this new kingdom is going to arise, the 6th kingdom of Bible prophecy. And as we said before, this kingdom is going to do the opposite of the 5th kingdom. So where it had oppression, it's going to now have freedom and equality, where inequality was. Now, what I want to say about this is that where I'm marking this as the ideal that they're striving for. I don't think the United States has ever fully achieved equality or fully achieved freedom for its citizens. There's been ups and downs and all of those things along the way. And we've gotten very close. And, again, like I said, there's been ups and downs in the state of freedom or the state of equality throughout our history. But the ideal that we're striving for, that we've tried to institutionalize, or that we've tried to we've tried to codify, are these ideas of freedom and equality, though we may not have actually achieved them in its proper form the way God intended. But we've strived for it, and so that's why I'm marking them here. So we have the fifth kingdom. It's marked by oppression and inequality. The sixth kingdom, where we're talking about, this kingdom is now going to do it a little bit differently, or very differently. They're going to do the opposite. They're going to do it, and they're going to codify freedom and equality. But we know that this kingdom is going to come to an end. And we know that we are standing right here, and you're probably not going to be able to see it very well, but I'm drawing a little stick figure. We're standing right before this point where the nation fully crumbles. Now, what's going to happen, and what we know very shortly, is the seventh kingdom is going to take over. And we know that the seventh kingdom, we know that there's nuance to that, the sixth, seventh, and eighth kingdom of Bible prophecy. But we know that the seventh kingdom is the rebirth, or the rehashing. We'll say rebirth. It's the rebirth of this beast. And it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to operate maybe slightly differently. It's going to be in a modern context. But the idea is that this beast is going to get revived. And we know that the United States is the prime mover in the resurrection of the image of the beast, or the beast. So you have the beast and you have the image of the beast, or the image to the beast, however you want to say it. So you have the beast and you have the image of the beast that's going to get raised over here. And when that happens, and we know, like I said, the United States is the prime mover. It's the one that this is focusing on, and it's also its relationship to the world. That when this happens, it's going to go back to oppression and inequality. Oops. In a way that wasn't here. So obviously, like I said, wasn't perfect here during this time, and there's lots of ups and downs, and there's struggle and everything that we could identify, but there's going to be a marked contrast here when this transition fully takes place, and when the image of the beast is resurrected, is raised, and you now have oppression and inequality brought back to life. So this is why it's so important for us to know about the beginning point, or the beginning history of the United States, because if we can identify how the United States begins, we can know how it's going to end. And so we can not just know how it's going to end, but we can even know the issues that will be present there. And so like I said just a little bit ago, what we know is that in the Declaration of Independence, the first thing that's mentioned, the very first thing that is of a tangible, or not tangible, is of a significant point, the main point of this is the issue of equality. That's the first thing that's going to get raised. And I hope that I'm emphasizing, I hope you understand the significance of that statement. Not only because of it must mean what they're striving for. They see how important equality is in that sense, but also because it's telling us where it's going to go. And it's also not only that, but it's telling us the contrast that was back here. So if they're saying from this point forward, we want to start, we want to be a nation that's built upon the equality of people, it means that there was inequality before. And we know that the Dark Ages is just wrought with inequality of all shapes and sizes, not just racial, all sorts, in every way of life, practically. So that's where we are, and that's why this is so significant, right there. And it's not an accident that we see the Midnight Cry message and we see, the movement today in this position where we're talking about the issue of equality, and embedded right into the founding documents of the United States is the issue of equality. So for me, that's an obvious second witness, or it's an obvious marker that you're on the right track, that you're seeing the right thing. That alignment of those two thoughts. So continuing, that all men are created equal. Now, for sake of time, we're probably not going to get into this much. Actually, we will have to, so never mind. So what we see here is that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, this is a much larger topic, the idea of unalienable rights, but what we see from unalienable rights is the idea that they are rights that can neither be given away nor taken away. And the reason that you as an individual cannot give your rights away and they cannot be taken from you is because you did not produce them in and of yourself, if that makes sense. You don't get your rights just because you're a human being. You get your rights because you were created by God and God gave you those rights. So it's His prerogative when you lose or gain rights, if we can say it that way. And those rights are embedded in you, I guess, if I can say it that way, in the sense that God has given them to you, and you cannot take or give them. You cannot take them or give them away, or they cannot be taken from you. So these unalienable rights, these rights that are given to you by God that aren't yours to give away and aren't yours to give up or to have taken from you, in that sense, they are yours. But it's as if you're holding them for someone else. I don't know the best way to say it, to express that idea. They are your rights and they are intrinsic with you because God created you, but they're not yours to give away, and they can't be taken from you. They're not something that you can even yield. So the rights here that are listed are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I want us to realize how broad those three things are. You have the right to life, you have the right to liberty, and you have the right to be happy. Now, all of those things have to be understood in the proper context. And I think personally, and I know this to be a fact, that many people today have a misunderstanding of not only what their rights are, but what it means to have a right and what it means to exercise your right to do something or to not do something, so on and so forth. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that at some point. But what we want to see here is that these are broad concepts: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have a right to be alive, you have the right to your liberty, your freedom, and you have the right to pursue happiness. Now, one issue with rights, and this is just rights in general, and again, like I said, we'll talk more about this, is that you don't have the right to infringe on somebody else's rights. So you only have the right to exercise your rights as long as the exercising of your rights doesn't harm someone else. And, we can get into examples of that, and we probably will later, but I just want to lay that broad thought out here for a moment. Now, one thing we see introduced here is the idea of the creator. Now, if you noticed it before, in the first sentence we read before, it said, the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, in that long first sentence, the preamble. It references nature's God. But it also mentions here a little bit more specifically the creator. And if you go through the document, the issue of a divinity being mentioned, a God being mentioned, is about 5 times. I think it's about 5 times, if I've read it correctly. And you can read through that. But regardless of how many times it is, there's an introduction of the existence of a deity and the relationship between that deity to humanity. And what the founders are saying here in this document is that all men are created equal, so they are created by a God, and that creator has endowed us as human beings with certain rights that I can't give you, nor can be taken away from me. And because of that, because of God's because he's given those things to me, we need to do the next thing. And the next thing that's mentioned here is the securing of those rights. And we'll read that now. That to secure these rights, the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the founders didn't enumerate every right that you have in this document. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not all the rights that any individual has, but they are umbrella rights. They're broad rights, trying to convey an idea. And one thing I want to mention here is that when we start talking about that sentence of all men are created equal, and we'll pause on the securing of the rights just for a moment, but that all men are created equal, when you look at that, all men being created equal does not mean all males. What they meant by men here is that all human beings are created equal. And no matter what your race, size, gender, whatever, affluence, or, whatever it may be or not be, all human beings are created equal. And it becomes in one thing that we need to, one thing that I believe, rather, is I think people are too cynical when they look at this point in history, when they look at the Declaration of Independence and they say, okay, these men are sitting in a room and they write this document that said all men are created equal. No way did they mean women too. But you can go back and you can look at the source material and whatnot, and they absolutely meant all men or all human beings are created equal. And there's this problem. And the problem here is that there's a difference between the ideal that they're writing down on this piece of paper. They're saying all men are created equal. But at the same time they write that on that piece of paper, half the room has slaves. Half the room, or at least some amount of the room, probably about half, maybe a little less than half, not only have slaves, but think that slaves are less than human, that they don't qualify in that statement. Now there's others in the room, and now you have the north-south divide, and those northerners do believe that they're humans, and they do have their own issues, of course, but they're far more progressive on that thought, on the thought of equality. But my point is about the cynicism of the hypocrisy. And yes, there's real hypocrisy in this, but they're shooting for an ideal. And I think someone put it in the chat before, it might have been private just to me, but they're shooting for an ideal or concept, though they didn't reach that concept in that moment that they wrote these things. And when we see the statement that all men are created equal, it doesn't mean all Americans are created equal. And I think this is something that Americans, I know that I have in the past have been ignorant of this fact of what I'm about to say. So I'll take personal responsibility for that one, at least in my own right, or my own sphere. I didn't understand that the Declaration of Independence is not an American document. Because remember, the United States isn't going to be created for another several years. It's not till 1789 that the United States is actually founded as a nation. You have a bunch of people come together, these colonists coming together, and they're saying, this is what we want to do. And what we want to do is found a nation based upon these broad principles, these good principles that we see. And the first thing we are acknowledging is that we have rights as human beings. So the thing that I was saying that I have been ignorant of is that this is actually not an American document. It is a human rights document. I would argue that this is probably one of the most important secular, maybe the most important secular human rights documents ever made. Declarations about human rights. And it's laid out clearly about those rights. My point in saying that is not to to tout how amazing this this document is, though it may be, is to lay out the idea that even in, how do I say it, this idea about equality transcends nations and borders and all of that. In this document is a human rights document about what all people have a right to. So, for instance, you talk about how, a good example of this may be so for instance, take something like Guantanamo Bay. That's the only thing I could think of off the top of my head. There's times in the United States history where we make prisons, or we make these facilities outside of U.S. borders so that we can do things that are bad. We can torture people, we can interrogate them in inhumane ways, for the express purpose of being outside of the border, so that it's a different set of laws that apply, not U.S. law, because they're not U.S. citizens. And my point in saying that is intrinsically in that thought is the idea that if you're in this border about, if you're in this border, the border of the United States, you're entitled to more freedom or more rights than you would be somewhere else. But that's not true, because everything that I'm entitled to as an American citizen, someone else is entitled to as well in whatever part of the world that they're in, because they're a human being. Just because you're born in a certain place doesn't mean you're more or less entitled to something. And I mean entitled not in like a childish way, but entitled by our Creator. The life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness idea. And what the United States was supposed to be was a beacon of light to spread those ideals across the world. And, we failed in that endeavor. Some successes, mostly failure. And that's what the idea was, is that this document would be a human rights document that would apply to everyone. And whether or not they knew it, but God knew it, and we know it today, that was God's intent for that document. And another reason I say that is because of the issue of nationalism. One of the issues that we see here that I think someone said it in the chat earlier. They mentioned the issue of unilateralism, where basically, and I mentioned it here on the board, I raised it earlier, the idea that the United States would be above all the other nations and they would subjugate the other nations, which we saw beginning in earnest with Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr., and the idea of the New World Order and whatnot, American superiority, and America being the only superpower to dominate the world. In that concept, that line of thought, intrinsic in that thought is this idea of American nationalism, and the Declaration of Independence, if read correctly, is actually the biggest rebuke to the idea of nationalism, because of the fact that it is a human rights document, because of the fact that it is trying to help people of all nations, and it can be applied to all nations. And again, whether or not they realized it at the time doesn't matter. That's the way it is, in terms of in terms of the fact of the matter, whether it was clear to them at the moment. So we've mentioned that, and again, I'm sorry for my belabored review that we're trying to do here. So there's that importance, and we'll come back to the idea of the creator momentarily, but first we want to look at the securing of rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So the role of government is to secure your rights. And secure in this sense doesn't mean to take those rights or to give you those rights or to, anything like that. The way the word secure there is being used is the idea of to keep safe your rights to do certain things, or to, regardless of doing certain things, to secure your rights, to keep safe your rights, all of your rights, your right to life, your right to liberty, and your right to pursue happiness in the appropriate way. So you have those rights, and the government's there not to give you the rights, not to take the rights, not to entitle you to the rights, but only to be there to keep those rights safe. And one thing I want to mention here, and it seems like an obvious thing, but it's an important thing, especially in the world in which we live today, where governments have become more and more institutionalized, where everything seems to be more and more institutionalized and sort of clinical, I guess you could say. Sterile might be the best word for that, if you understand what I mean by that, and I'll try to explain. Today, when we think about government, we don't think, oh, that's my government. And by my government, it means the government I'm setting up. We think of the government as this thing that is over us, this thing that is, that we sort of pay homage to in one way or another, not the thing that is there to secure our rights and that we are the owners of. It's been perverted, and this perversion of what the government should be has really been the only thing that maybe humanity, but we've known for a very long time, this perversion, this idea of the government being over us or whatnot. Because when you think about it, if you look at the Constitution founds the government, and that document begins with, we the people establish a nation. We the people establish a government. The government didn't establish itself. We set it up. It is a government, as Abraham Lincoln would say. It is, how did he say it? Of the people, for the people, by the people, of the people. I'm saying it in the wrong order, I'm sure, but that is what he said. I think I have the quote. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's how he says it. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is all about the people. Their duty is to secure your rights. Now, this becomes, the reason I'm belaboring this point in this moment is because we find ourselves at least in the United States, and I'm sure this is something that's everyone else is affected by as well, about what is the role of the government in securing our rights. Once you start looking to the ideas of, for instance, how a government should run itself in a pandemic, what rights, what actions is the government allowed to take, should the government take in a pandemic? Something like that, where we're going to talk about, keeping people isolated or not allowing people to work or this, that, and the other thing. You now have a question about, well, is that the government's duty? Is it what they're there to do to enforce a lockdown? Or are they there to keep me safe from this pandemic? Is it the job of the government to keep me safe or to keep me alive? Those are questions that need to get answered, because from my experience in the United States, there's a lot of confusion on questions like that. And I think that is where most of the issues come from, is about what is the government's role in regards to our rights and to the citizen. So there's real world present application to the conversations we're having, or to the point we're trying to make in looking at the Declaration of Independence here. And if I can go off on a small tangent for just a moment, and then I'll rein myself back in, this issue about the structure of the government, the issue about, is this a government for the people, of the people, and by the people, is the same in the relationship between government and people, is the identical relationship that, or a very similar one, maybe not identical, but a very similar one, with how this movement is or should be run. How the movement relates, how the broad organization or the institution relates to the individual within the movement, is the same way or a similar way as how the government should, what the government is supposed to or should interact with its citizens as, in that way. It's the same thing. There's an internal and an external of this, of the way institutions should relate to the individual, and vice versa, and how an institution should relate to an organization, or an individual should, to an institution. And there's a big conversation that you could have in talking about the structure of things, internally and externally, and how the individual and the institution relate, and what institutions, or whether internally or externally, what their rights are, what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing, so on and so forth. And it would probably be prudent for all of us to have a working knowledge of those kind of things. But that's my side tangent, and we're not going to go down that route this moment. But to rein us back in, so it is the duty, or the not the duty, I'm missing the word. The duty is the only thing that's coming to my mind. It's the duty of the government. It's the role of the government. It's the reason it was set up, to secure the said rights, the rights that we're talking about. And once we understand that is the role of government, it fixes a lot of problems. And it helps us to identify what is being done correctly and incorrectly today or in the past, of the United States. And it's something we have to understand more clearly, and there's a lot we could say about it, but I don't want to belabor that point too much. But if we continue, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. So we said governments are instituted among, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So that's what they're supposed to do, secure the rights. And they derive their power from the consent of the people who are governing them. A government cannot run without the consent, or it should not run, and cannot in the sense of it shouldn't, It should not run without the consent of those it's governing. Because remember, it is a government for the people, by the people, of the people. So if a government is breaking those, its duty or its obligation, that's what the next point is, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter it, to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So again, and it says as a repeat and enlarge, you could say, in that last sentence, it's saying, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So again, defining the idea of what the duty of the government is to keep you safe and it's to keep you happy, or to keep you happy in a correct way. That you can pursue your happiness, and that nobody's killing you or murdering you or attacking you, so you have that safety, or other threats. If there's a natural disaster or something like that. I mean, you could get into all those details. But anyway, that is the duty of the government, is for safety and happiness and to secure our rights. And what I want to emphasize now, in trying to wrap up our review, is, or this part of it, the government, what's the best way to say that? As I said before, the United States government can be, or the way the government should be, or the role of government, let me say not even the US government, we'll just say the role of government can be seen in an internal way when you're looking at the movement, but also externally with, actual governments, secular governments. But when you start delving down, into that, what you realize is that these principles that are being laid out here about the government of the United States, or what government should be, not only does it reflect the movement or other governments, but it reflects the government of God. And it can be seen in two ways. In the primary two thoughts of this document are these two. If I can summarize the entire Declaration of Independence into these two phrases: all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's the first thought, that you are created equal, that you were endowed by your Creator and created equal with certain unalienable rights. Thought number one. Thought number two is the idea of the consent of the governed, that the role of the government, and that it needs your consent. So the idea of the consent of the governed and the idea of unalienable rights become the two primary points of this government. And those two primary points can also be seen in the government of God. So the first one is obvious, because God's government is obviously based upon equality and the fact that you have these rights because He's the one who gave them to you. So that's an easy one to see, the value that God places in you, in these rights, these unalienable rights. But the second point, the point of consent, can also be seen in the government of God, because if anyone could declare themselves an absolute monarch justly and rightly and rule over people, it would be God. He's the only one who can make that claim. But not even God does that. God does not rule over us without our consent. For you to enter into His for Him to rule over you, you have to consent to it. You have to enter His government expressly through the covenant relationship that you enter into with Him. And once you enter into that covenant relationship, you're now there by your free will consent. Now you're in the government of God. You're in that nation, but you're not even forced to be there any longer. You at any moment you can decide, you know what, I don't want to be part of the nation of God, the nation of heaven, so to speak. And at any moment you can leave and say, I've had enough. And this is one of the strongest, if you really want to get into the idea of once saved, always saved, this would be one of the things you'd have to look at, is the idea of, what if you didn't want to be there and God would force you to be there, and you can get into all that. And God never forces anyone to be in his presence and in his nation, which, again, is the consent of the governed. So God's government is founded on these same principles as well, of consent and value, or unalienable rights. Okay. So what we want to do now, for just a moment, is we're going to go. So I'm just going to take I'm going to take one more moment to just illustrate two more things. Hopefully they'll be quick, and then we'll get going to our next point. Sorry, we're belaboring the Declaration and the Constitution, more the Declaration than the Constitution. So the first thing we want to do, I just want to emphasize quickly, is the idea of, and this will be very, very brief. We could have a longer conversation about it, but I mentioned before the idea of the Creator. So in the Constitution, or in the Declaration of Independence, and this is the Declaration of Independence here on the left, a Creator is mentioned about 5 times. I think it's about 5 times. In the Constitution, that will be this square over here. A Creator is mentioned 0 times. And one question I always ask is, why is there this discrepancy between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Why is it okay, and why isn't it a breach of the combination of church and state for them to mention a Creator in the Declaration, but in the Constitution they don't mention any of those things? And we're not going to have a conversation about that just for sake of time. But what we see, to give the answer to the question, is that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are dealing with 2 different things. And for us to realize what they're dealing with, we have to understand the role of these 2 documents, but not only their role, but also the historical context of them. And those are almost redundant. I'll try to make the separation. So the Declaration of Independence is a document, as we said, written in 1776, declaring the independence of the United States against Great Britain. It's saying, we're going to separate ourselves from you, and these are the reasons why. So what the Declaration of Independence does is it creates a hierarchy, if you read closely, of that is very different than the system that they were under. And I'll try to depict that here. So here you have I'm just going to call it the papacy. I know that's, again, the wrong way, but I'm just going to say papacy as the 5th kingdom of Bible prophecy. The Old World, Great Britain, all of that history that we're talking about, as the darkness, the 1260. Or we can just do it that way. We'll just call it the 1260. That'll be better. You have the 1260, and there's a hierarchy that is embedded in that history. And then you have the USA in 1776. But again, anyway. So in the 1260, the hierarchy of society was this. You had God, and God gave power to the church and to the state. And God put those people in charge, specifically the state, which is a monarchy. It's the divine right to rule. God puts the church, or sorry, not the church, the state in place. And he has that monarch has the divine right to rule. And you being the individual or the people, are in subjection to that monarch. So the hierarchy is God, then the state, then the people. But the Declaration of Independence turns that on its head slightly by saying this. And we've already read it. It's the idea of the consent of the governed. It's the idea of the equality of people and these unalienable rights that no government or individuals can trample on. It frames the hierarchy this way. God, still on top, but instead of the state, it's the people who are in charge. And then the state is in subordination to the state. And it is by the consent of the governed. It's the people, we the people, a government for the people, by the people, of the people, that creates the state. So it's a different hierarchy, and it changes everything when you change that one point. And coming back to our question here, now that we see this hierarchy, the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is that the Declaration of Independence is dealing with the relationship between God and the people. It's a human rights document. It's saying this is the hierarchy, this is the people's relationship to God, and because we have this relationship to God, the state cannot interfere in that relationship. It is that relationship with God is above the state, and the state can have no place in that conversation or in that relationship. But the Constitution, and that is why it can mention God, is because it's dealing with the relationship between God and people. But the Constitution deals with something entirely different. It is how a state is going to organize itself and what its relationship is to individuals or to the people. So the Constitution is down here. It's dealing with the relationship between the people and the state. And that distinction is the difference between why the Declaration of Independence is allowed to talk about God, while the Constitution can't mention God, and if it did mention God, it would be breaching the idea of the church-state relationship, or the idea of the separation of church and state, rather. You also have the idea that the Constitution, how do I say that? The Constitution is a document that deals with the establishment of a nation. It's a legal document. It's a legally binding document, while the Declaration of Independence is just that. It's a declaration. Now, I want to mention one more thing. So about these two documents, and this is really important for where we are today. So let me draw my squares again. Actually, we'll do it a little differently. So you have the Declaration. And you have the Constitution. These two documents. So the Declaration of Independence is the primary principles that we saw is that it is the first one was consent, consent of the governed. Then we have value, the value of the individual, in that you are creating you have these unalienable rights, rather. So you have the Declaration of Independence. First primary idea is consent. then the value of the individual, and then thirdly, that of equality, the equality of the individuals or people, all people. So the three primary principles of the Declaration of Independence is the idea of consent, value, and equality. Those are the three primary thoughts. Now, I want to talk about the relationship between these two documents for just a moment. And it's something I think that is missed often by people in a general sense. The Declaration of Independence may not be a legally binding document, which it is not. But what the Declaration of Independence is an idea. It's a concept. It's a theme. It's the idea of how these people or how anyone should form a government, form a new nation. And it becomes, if I can say it this way, the spirit of the nation. And so I want to identify the Declaration of Independence as the spirit. And that spirit is going to help mold and that spirit is going to get put into concrete form, and it's going to create the Constitution. So the Declaration of Independence is the spirit of the law, or the spirit of the nation, but the Constitution is the letter of the nation. It's the idea of, how would I say it? It's the fine details. You know, you have this idea, it's great, this idea of consent and value and equality, but how do we do that actually? How do we do that in a way that we're all can be held accountable for it? And the way that we do that is through the Constitution, where we lay out these guidelines and we say, okay, this is what I want. I want, 3 separate branches of government. There's a lot of checks and balances between them. Here's the rights of the people, so on and so forth. So the Declaration of Independence is the spirit of the United States, or the spirit of the law, you could say, and the Constitution is the letter of the law. Now, which one is more important, the letter or the spirit? And that's my question for everyone. Which one is more important, the letter or the spirit? So we had one person say the spirit. Any other thoughts? A couple people are saying the spirit. A lot of people, most saying the spirit. The spirit is more important, but there's a problem. Now, you can run into a problem. For instance, if you need the letter, but you also need the spirit. They go together. They go hand in hand, the spirit and the letter, and the letter and the spirit. They do go together, but the spirit is the more important of the two because it's the theme or the filter by which you're going to use to make decisions. And let me give you a good example of this. Or let me give you an example of this. A good example might be something else, but now I'm blanking on a good example of this. So you have a law, and what would be a good law to depict this? I can't think of a specific law. So you have this law, and it's, well, let's make a law. Maybe that will help me in this example. Okay, here's a good one. So you have the First Amendment, which are laws. And in the First Amendment, you have the separation of church and state. You have the right to peaceably assemble. You have the right to speech. All of these different rights. There's several rights enumerated in that First Amendment. So we will take the idea of freedom of speech, for instance. So if I make a law that is expressed appropriately, so the law says something like, you can't, I'm blanking on a really concrete way to say this, so let me try to say it in more kind of an abstract way without a good example. So sometimes you have laws, or you have the enforcement of laws, where the law or the enforcement of a good law can actually be unconstitutional or break the spirit of the law. Let me say it that way. So you have a law or the enforcement of a law, and the way that you enforce that law, or the way that that law is written, depending on either case, depending on an example, that would actually go against the spirit of that law. And here's what I mean. Sometimes what we do here, or what I think one of the chief offenders of this concept is the president. And I've mentioned this before in other presentations with examples as well. I think the president is one of the chief offenders of the idea of following the letter of the law while breaking its spirit. And that is one of the problems I think that we have today in this conversation about the president, about Donald Trump, is the problem that he's not breaking laws explicitly, but what he is doing is breaking the spirit of those laws in the way that he's following the law, or the way that he's carrying himself. And I know that's not a good example, and I hopefully you understand what I mean, but sometimes what is legal on paper is not what should be there in the spirit of the law. So that could be, something like a good example of this would be the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In 1850, they have the Fugitive Slave Act, and you have the issue with Dred Scott. And so that is something that is, the way it is written is wrong. The way it's written is wrong, and obviously the spirit of it is wrong. There's nothing good about it. So that's one type of example. But there's the other kind of example where you have things that are legal, where you have the separation of branches, we'll say. In the gray area between the separation of branches, for instance, might be an example. But anyway, you have these laws that are legal and good, but the way that people live by those laws, or the way that they try to manipulate them or bend them, they do it in such a way as to where they're following the law, but they're breaking the spirit of the law. And here's an example. I thought of example. It's not a legal example, but it's like, for whatever reason, the law's a harder example to come up with, even a fake one. But here's a good example, and I've used this one before just in a slightly different way. So you have a bunch of children, and you've given them all Nerf guns. And if anyone doesn't know what a Nerf gun is here, they're little toy guns that shoot little plastic foam bullets. And they don't hurt or anything like that. Maybe if you hit in the eye or something, but they're for children. So you give these children these guns, these little toy guns, and they're going to play. And so they start playing, and you tell them, you say, don't. So they start playing with them, and they start shooting each other. And at first, and so you're like, okay, no, we don't want anyone to get hurt. And so you stop them and you say, okay, from now on, all you're allowed to do is shoot at the wall, because we don't want anyone getting hurt, because, Sally already got shot in the eye, and Johnny, got shot in the eye, and, everyone's crying, and it's getting hectic. So what we're going to do is you're only allowed to shoot at the target at the wall. So we'll put a target there, and you can only shoot there. So what is the spirit behind what I've just the law that I have created. The spirit behind that law is I don't want anyone to get hurt, and I want people to be happy. So, we'll just say those two. I don't want anyone to get hurt, and I want people to be able to pursue their happiness safely. So what happens next is these little kids, they find a way around what's going on. And so what they start doing is they stand really close to the wall, and they shoot at the wall, which is what I said they could do. And they shoot at the wall, but because of how close they are to the wall, it ricochets off the wall and hits another kid. And so technically, they're not shooting each other because they're shooting the wall, like you said, only shoot the wall. But they're manipulating or bending what you said and still following the law that you gave while actually breaking the spirit of the law that you gave them, which was safety and the happiness, of the room, all the kids in the room. That's the same problem that we have today in the United States. Is there's so many things that are going on where things may be legal, but that doesn't mean that they're following the spirit or the principles of what the United States was set up to do. And like I said before, I think Donald Trump is one of the chief offenders in this. There's lots of examples of that, and I would challenge people to take that mindset, that idea, and test it and say, okay, and what I'm saying is correct about the idea of what can be legal but breaks the spirit, and see the way that you see that in the world. Not just Donald Trump. Lots of people do it. There's problems with that all over the place. But he's one of the more prominent ones. So that's an important facet that we're seeing here. This relationship between the spirit and the letter, between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and how they operate and the relationship between the two of them. And as we all have said before, it's infinitely important for us to understand the spirit so that when we assess the letter and we try to follow the letter, we will do so correctly. A good example would be this. So we know that health reform is about, so we can say, okay, we're supposed to be vegan. And the reason you're supposed to be vegan, the spirit behind that, lots of reasons, is that one of the reasons, though, is for health, we'll say. So you have this reason of health. Or you can say you don't have to use veganism. You can use anything, any idea like this. So you say, okay, I want to be healthy. The idea is God wants us to be healthy. And so one of the ways to be healthy, the primary way that, he wants us to learn is to not eat meat. Because that's, all the health risks of meat eating. So you say, okay, I'm a vegan now. I'm not going to eat meat anymore, or dairy or whatnot, all that stuff, animal products. And the reason I'm doing that is to be healthy, is to have my body in a certain form. But you can break the spirit of that being vegan. If you were vegan and all you ate was processed junk, once or twice you might be okay. But if you start eating this as a habit, and it's going to affect you eventually. And so you're eating vegan, so you're following the letter, but you're breaking the spirit because you are actually still hurting your body. Because it really didn't, the idea, there wasn't, how do I say it? It's less about meat eating, being vegan, or, that kind of thing. It's less about eating, meat, and more about eating healthy. It's being healthy, eating healthy food, in whatever form that you have. And so the point is being healthy is my point in the issue of that. And you can still follow the letter while breaking the spirit. And so that would be an example of that. So let me just finish up with this thought here. So you have the Declaration of Independence in 1776. We never finished this, and that's my fault. You have the Declaration of Independence in 1776. A message arrives. The message that arrives here in 1776 is the message of freedom that is in opposition to the darkness of the 1260. It's a message that says we're going to do it this way. We're going to have God, then the people, then the state. We're not going to do God, state, people. We're going to change that. We're going to reform that. And so the introduction of a message or light or reformation comes here. And now that idea has to get, if we think about the time of the end, the increase of knowledge, the formalization in the door, the end of this dispensation here, the idea arrives, the message arrives, and now there's going to be an increase of knowledge. For the United States, the increase of knowledge is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. This is where the United States first begins to put these ideas, this spirit, these ideas, these themes into concrete form. And that's what the increase of knowledge is. A message arrives, but it needs to get understood more. It needs to get formalized. It needs to get more concrete bearings on it. But the increase of knowledge marks the time period where that begins to happen. And that's what the Articles of Confederation are for the United States. It's where they first start to do that. It wasn't perfect. They made a lot of mistakes with the Articles of Confederation, hence the need to write the Constitution when they abolish it. But it's where they first begin to cut their teeth, so to speak, on that idea, on implementing these ideas. But we come to 1789 with the Constitution. And now this spirit, these ideas of consent, value, and equality are now going to be put into a concrete, formalized package that people can be tested by. Just like the message. You have the message arrives, you have an increase of knowledge on that message, where you start cutting your teeth with it a little bit, learning it, and then it's formalized into a nice little package. That's the same thing that happens here for the United States. The formalized message happens with the Constitution. And now it's a fully fleshed out idea and something that they can be held accountable to. And this is when the government is established here. So I know that was quick and just explaining that, and there's a lot more we could say about these two events, these two waymarks of the increase of knowledge and the formalization. And maybe we will in later presentations. But for now, we just need to get that in place. And that was a long review. It took most of our presentations just to do the review. I hope it was beneficial so far, the review part of it. We have to close in just a moment. So what we're going to do is when we come back, so what we've done is we've fleshed out the idea of the Declaration of Independence, the principles in it, the hierarchy it creates, how it is the spirit to the letter here, and how the idea that what we need to understand now here at the end of the world is not just the Constitution. You hear people talk about left and right, on the left and on the right, politically, that we need to, that somebody's doing this that is unconstitutional, or somebody's doing, or constitutionality this, constitutionality that, and that is important. But if we don't understand the principles and the spirit behind the Constitution, we can never interpret the Constitution correctly, which is one of the biggest issues with the Constitution, is how do you interpret it? Just like you pick up your Bible and you say, how am I going to interpret this Bible, or even history, or inspiration in general, whatever it may be, what principles am I going to use to interpret this thing that I'm looking at, is almost more important than the thing you're even looking at. Because you're never going to come to the right conclusion without the right principles. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is. It lays out the principles for these, for this concrete form here. And if we understand the Declaration of Independence and its spirit and its principles correctly, we can almost instantly identify when people are infringing those principles here at the end of the world, or even as we look back in history, when we see laws being passed that may be constitutional, but they break the spirit, or they, or at least the interpretation of them, or the way they're implemented, those kind of things. So that is what I'm trying to help us, trying to build for us, is this difference between the spirit and the letter, and how we go about using that tool of the Declaration of Independence to understand where we are today. And as we all said, it's the spirit that is more important than the letter here. Because the letter, and a good example of this would be the Jews. The Jews perfectly followed the letter of the law, but they were a corrupt economy. They were a corrupt people, even though they perfectly followed the letter of the law, because they never understood or followed, or at least the ones in the time of Christ, didn't understand or follow the spirit of the law, so that when they lived out the letter of the law, they did so from a pharisaical perspective, a formalism that had no power behind it, no oomph behind it, no power behind it. And here, Christ comes and he expresses to them, yes, you may have the letter, even though you may have the letter, but if you have the spirit, you realize that you're breaking the letter. You're breaking everything because you're not following the spirit of the law. And that is what Christ came to do, is to show them that. And that is the work of the 144,000 here at the end of the world, whether it be religiously or politically, or, from the societally. Our job is to understand the spirit of the law, or the spirit of the, whether it be religious or political or whatever, is to understand the principles, so that we can show the disparity here at the end of the world between the spirit and the letter. Because if you think we're going to get to the Sunday law, and it's just going to be this huge abrogation of the Constitution, where they're just going to make a law that says, from this point forward, church and state is combined, we're going to persecute all these people and kill them. If we think that's what it's going to look like, we're going to miss it. It's going to look far more normal. It's going to look more normal. But what it will inevitably do, what it will have to do, is break the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, the spirit of the experiment that was the American Republic. And so what we're going to do when we come back tomorrow, and again, sorry for the long review, is we're going to begin looking at, I think I said it as the role of the individual in its relationship to the nation. And I want to look at that idea about how the individual relates to what the nation does. And we'll probably won't get too much past that idea, but hopefully we can dredge that out just a little bit in our final presentation. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this time that we've had, for your mercy, your grace, your love, your wisdom and long suffering with us, Lord. I pray that you would forgive us of our sins, that you would forgive us where we've fallen short in following the spirit, Lord, of your law and of what is right, Lord. I pray that you would guide us to understand your principles and to love your principles, Lord, that we would be changed and we would live a principled life, Lord. We'd live by the Spirit, Lord. And I pray that you would guide us to understand how here at the end of the world, how things look, Lord, and how the Spirit and the letter work, and how things are being twisted. And I pray that you would give each and every one of us lips and eyes to see the discrepancies and to the injustices, and lips to appropriately and rightfully explain those truths, Lord, to people in a way that would change their perception in their lives as well. We ask that you'd be with us now as we break this evening, and we thank you for the Sabbath day that we're soon to enter. We thank you and we love you in Jesus' name. Amen.